Okay, so I'm going to show you how to solve a logic problem. At this point, you should pull out your copy of this logic problem sheet and fill it out along with me to make sure you get the correct answer. This problem says there are 4 men who live in Willowbrook Estates on the city's north side. They planted a different type of tree in the front yard on Arbor Day. From the clues below, determine the first and last name of each man and the type of tree they planted. So we want to fill out this table at the very bottom of the form. This is where our answer is going to be. And we need to figure out the first name that goes along with the last name and what tree each person planted. We're going to figure that out by looking at each clue and using those clues to either put an X or fill in the spot saying whether they did not or they did have that match. Based on that information, we're going to fill out the table below. So the first thing we can do is we can fill out the first name of each individual. So we know we have George, and we know we have Harvey, and Ivan, and John. So now we can start looking at some of our clues. The first clue says George, Mr. Clary, and Mr. Becker all live within 3 blocks of one another. Since they live close to each other, that means they can't be the same person. So we know that George doesn't have either of those 2 surnames. So I can take an X in each one of those 2 boxes. George is not Mr. Becker. George is not Mr. Clary. The second clue tells me that Mr. Clary did not plant the cedar tree or the maple tree. So similarly, I can go Clary and put an X along with cedar and maple. The third clue says that Harvey and Mr. Clary live next door to one another. So again, they can't possibly be the same person. So Harvey is not Mr. Clary. The ash tree was not planted by John or Ivan. So the ash tree is not Ivan and is not John. The maple tree was not planted by George, who is not named Delgado. So if George is not Delgado, that means the only possible option for George now is Erickson. So I'm going to fill in the Erickson box and George, because that's our match. And down on my table below, I'll write in that George is Mr. Erickson. Now because George is Mr. Erickson, it means that nobody else can possibly be Mr. Erickson, so we can put some X's down for all of those options as well. Going back to the clue, it tells us that the maple tree was not planted by George, so George did not plant the maple tree. And since we now know that George is Mr. Erickson also could not have planted the maple tree because they're the same person. Mr. Erickson is not the man who planted the ash tree, so Mr. Erickson did not plant the ash tree. And again, George and Mr. Erickson are the same person, so George did not plant the ash tree. And now we have only one option left for trees, so that means that Harvey planted the ash tree. So I can fill in that box there. I know that Harvey planted the ash tree. And because Harvey planted the ash tree, it means he didn't plant any of the other types of tree. So I can fill in those X's there. So let's take a look at number 7. Number 7 says John isn't the man who planted a sycamore. So John can get an X for sycamore. So we've now gone through all of the clues once and we don't have a solution. So we need to start going through the clues again with a bit more of a fine-tooth comb. The first thing I can notice is that John bought his tree at the Green Thumb Greenhouse and Mr. Becker bought his tree at the Hometown Garden Center. So those 2 cannot be the same person. So John and Mr. Becker cannot be the same person. The next thing I can notice is that Harvey planted the ash tree. And Harvey is not Mr. Clary, so Mr. Clary could not have planted the ash tree. Right? If Harvey planted the ash tree, and Harvey is not Mr. Clary can't plant the ash tree. That means that Mr. Clary must have planted the sycamore tree. Now we can't fill that out in our table below because we don't know the first name that goes with Mr. Clary. But we can see that since Mr. Clary planted the sycamore and Harvey and George are not Mr. Clary, we do know that George could not have planted the sycamore because he can't be Mr. Clary. So that leaves George with having to have planted the cedar tree. So we can fill in that box there. And down here, George filled in the cedar tree. Now if we look at our table, it says George did the cedar tree, which means that Erickson did the cedar tree. So we can fill in that box. Erickson did the cedar tree. And if Mr. Erickson did the cedar tree, that means that nobody else did the cedar tree, and that Mr. Erickson did not do anything else. Just like the sycamore tree could not have been planted by anybody else, and the cedar tree could not have been planted by anybody else. You can see we're starting to fill in some of our boxes here. That leaves us with only one option for John. John must have planted the maple tree. So I can put in my box here for John and the maple tree. John must have done the maple tree. And I can fill in my X here, leaving one only option left, which is Ivan and the sycamore tree. So we now know that Ivan did the sycamore tree. Again, going back and looking at some of our boxes, if Ivan did the sycamore tree and the sycamore tree was Mr. Clary, that means that Ivan must be Mr. Clary. So we can fill that box in and put the rest of our X's across and down. And we can fill in here that Ivan is Mr. Clary. And we now only have one option left for John. John must be Mr. Delgado. Leaving our last surname as Becker. And now you have your solution.